Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. Selangor's 19th Century Civil War by Just Stories. Chapter 1: The Roots of Conflict. Selangor was a Malay sultanate that had been part of the greater Malay world for centuries before the arrival of Europeans. It was a prosperous region, rich in natural resources such as tin, rubber, and timber, and had a diverse population of Malays, Chinese, and Indians. However, by the mid-19th century, the Selangor Sultanate was facing significant challenges as a result of rapid changes in the global economy and the arrival of European colonial powers. The British, who had established a trading post in Penang in 1786, began to exert more influence over the Malay Peninsula in the mid-1800s. They saw Selangor as a key strategic location for its rich natural resources and began to negotiate with the Sultan to establish a treaty that would allow them to trade and protect their interests in the region. The treaty was eventually signed in 1857, and it marked the beginning of British intervention in Selangor affairs. The treaty gave the British the power to mediate disputes between the Sultan and his subjects, and to act as a neutral third party in conflicts. However, this often led to the British taking sides in disputes and, in some cases, directly intervening in the Sultanate's affairs. The British also imposed taxes on tin and other commodities, which contributed to rising tensions between the Sultan and his subjects. Meanwhile, the economy of Selangor was rapidly changing. Tin mining had become the dominant industry in the region, and Chinese migrants were coming in large numbers to work in the mines. The Chinese formed their own communities and began to play an increasingly important role in the economic and social life of Selangor. This led to a growing rivalry between the Malays and the Chinese, as each group vied for control over resources and power. Within the Malay community itself, there were also tensions and divisions. The Sultanate was governed by a hierarchical system of nobles, with the Sultan at the top, and there were often power struggles between different noble families. The British intervention in Selangor affairs only exacerbated these divisions, as the British tended to favor certain nobles over others and to play them off against each other. Finally, the impact of colonialism and global trade on Selangor society was also profound. Traditional customs and beliefs were eroding, as Western ideas and technologies began to penetrate the region. Some Malays saw the British as a threat to their way of life, while others welcomed their presence as a means of modernizing and developing the region. All of these factors contributed to a growing sense of unease and instability in Selangor, and set the stage for the outbreak of conflict in the late 1860s. The battle for power had begun, and it would have far-reaching consequences for Selangor and the wider Malay world. Chapter 2: The Early Battles. The late 1860s marked the beginning of a period of intense conflict in Selangor. The Sultanate was divided into factions, with different noble families and groups competing for power and control over resources. At the heart of the conflict was the question of who would benefit most from the booming tin industry: the Malay nobles, the Chinese miners, or the British colonial authorities. The early battles of the Selangor Civil War were characterized by a series of clashes between rival factions, often over issues such as control of land and taxes on tin. These battles were relatively small-scale and localized, but they set the stage for larger and more violent confrontations to come. One of the earliest clashes took place in 1867, when a group of Chinese miners attacked and killed several Malay villagers who were attempting to assert control over a tin mine. This led to retaliation from the Malays, who burned down several Chinese settlements in response. The violence quickly escalated, with both sides mobilizing their forces and launching attacks on each other's positions. The Chinese, who were better organized and more heavily armed than the Malays, gained the upper hand in many of these early battles. They formed secret societies, such as the Gihin and Hai San, which provided them with a powerful network of support and protection. These societies also played a key role in organizing Chinese miners and other workers, and in defending their interests against other groups. Meanwhile, the Malays were struggling to unify their forces and to establish a coherent strategy for resisting the Chinese and British. The different noble families were often at odds with each other, and there was little centralized leadership or coordination. The British, who had initially attempted to remain neutral in the conflict, were increasingly drawn into the fray as they sought to protect their interests and to maintain order in the region. The early battles of the Selangor Civil War were marked by a high degree of violence and brutality. Both sides committed atrocities and engaged in acts of revenge against their opponents. The conflict also had a profound impact on the local population, as villages were destroyed, families were displaced, and trade was disrupted. Despite these challenges, the different factions in Selangor continued to fight for their respective interests. The early battles set the stage for a more protracted and complex conflict, which would shape the course of Selangor's history for years to come. Chapter 3: The Height of the War. The Selangor Civil War reached its peak in the early 1870s as both sides ramped up their efforts to gain control over the region. The conflict had moved beyond localized clashes between rival factions and had become a full-scale war, with large armies of Malay and Chinese fighters engaged in battles across Selangor. At the height of the war, the Chinese had the upper hand, thanks to their better organization, weapons, and military tactics. They had formed alliances with other secret societies in the region and were able to call upon significant resources to support their cause. The Malays, by contrast, were struggling to unify their forces and to establish a coherent strategy for resisting the Chinese. The Chinese were particularly successful in their use of guerrilla warfare tactics, which allowed them to strike at the Malays from unexpected directions and to avoid direct confrontations. They were also able to draw upon their extensive networks of support among the Chinese communities in Selangor, who provided them with food, shelter, and information. The Malays, however, were not without their own strengths. They were fighting on their home turf and were able to make use of their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They were also able to draw upon the support of some British officials who saw the Chinese as a threat to British interests in the region. As the war intensified, both sides became increasingly desperate. The Chinese launched a series of brutal attacks on Malay villages, destroying homes and killing civilians. The Malays responded with their own acts of revenge, and the conflict became a cycle of violence and retribution. The British, who had initially attempted to remain neutral in the conflict, were increasingly drawn into the fray. They sent troops to Selangor to restore order and to protect their interests, but their intervention only served to complicate the situation further. The Malays viewed the British as biased towards the Chinese, while the Chinese saw the British as a threat to their own interests. The height of the war was a time of great suffering and destruction in Selangor. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, and families were torn apart. The conflict had a profound impact on the region's economy, as trade was disrupted and mining operations were shut down. It also had a lasting impact on the social and political structures of Selangor, as the balance of power shifted in favor of the Chinese and the British. Despite the hardships and challenges of the height of the war, the conflict eventually came to an end. The different factions in Selangor agreed to a peace settlement in 1874, which established a new political order in the Sultanate. The legacy of the Selangor Civil War, however, continued to shape the region's history for decades to come. Chapter 4: The Aftermath and Legacy. The Selangor Civil War had a profound impact on the Sultanate and the wider Malay world. The conflict had lasted for several years and had resulted in widespread destruction and suffering. The aftermath of the war was marked by efforts to rebuild and to establish a new political order in Selangor. One of the key outcomes of the war was the establishment of a more centralized government in Selangor. The old system of noble families vying for power was replaced with a more modern administrative structure, with a sultan at the top and appointed officials overseeing different aspects of governance. This helped to stabilize the region and to establish a more coherent system of law and order. The war also had a lasting impact on the social and economic structures of Selangor. The Chinese, who had emerged as the dominant force in the conflict, were able to consolidate their power and to establish themselves as a key economic and political force in the region. They controlled many of the tin mines and were able to use their economic leverage to influence the Sultan and the British authorities. The Malays, by contrast, had suffered greatly during the conflict. Many had lost their homes, their crops, and their livelihoods. The war had also exposed the weaknesses of the Malay political and military structures and had highlighted the need for reform and modernization. The British, who had played a significant role in the conflict, also emerged from the war with greater influence in Selangor. They had sent troops to the region to restore order and to protect their interests, and they had succeeded in establishing themselves as a key player in Selangor's political and economic landscape. The aftermath of the war also had wider implications for the Malay world as a whole. The Selangor Civil War was one of several conflicts that had erupted across the region in the mid-19th century, as different factions and groups vied for power and control. These conflicts had exposed the weaknesses of traditional Malay governance structures and had highlighted the need for reform and modernization. In response to these challenges, a new generation of Malay leaders emerged, who sought to modernize their societies and to resist the encroachment of colonial powers. These leaders recognized the need for education, infrastructure development, and economic reform, and worked to establish new institutions and structures to achieve these goals. The legacy of the Selangor Civil War, therefore, was both complex and far-reaching. It had exposed the fault lines and tensions within Malay society, but it had also paved the way for new forms of governance and leadership. It had highlighted the challenges of balancing competing interests and maintaining stability in a rapidly changing world, but it had also demonstrated the resilience and determination of the people of Selangor to overcome these challenges. Chapter 5: The Selangor Civil War in Historical Context. The Selangor Civil War was a complex and multifaceted conflict, with deep roots in the economic, political, and social structures of the Sultanate. However, the war also had broader implications for the wider Malay world, and can be understood as part of a broader pattern of conflict and change in the region. The mid-19th century was a time of great upheaval in Southeast Asia, as colonial powers such as Britain and France began to assert their dominance over the region. This had a profound impact on the traditional political and economic structures of the Malay world, as new forms of governance and economic organization were imposed upon the region. The Selangor Civil War was one of several conflicts that erupted during this period, as different factions and groups sought to assert their control over their societies in the face of these changes. Similar conflicts occurred in neighboring regions such as Perak, Pahang, and Johor, as well as in other parts of Southeast Asia such as Siam and Vietnam. These conflicts had several common themes and characteristics. They often pitted traditional elites against emerging groups such as Chinese migrants, who were rapidly establishing themselves as key players in the region's economy. They also highlighted the challenges of balancing competing interests and maintaining stability in the face of rapid change and uncertainty. At the same time, however, these conflicts also provided opportunities for new forms of leadership and governance to emerge. The Malay leaders who emerged from the Selangor Civil War recognized the need for reform and modernization, and worked to establish new institutions and structures to achieve these goals. One of the key legacies of the Selangor Civil War, therefore, was the emergence of a new generation of Malay leaders who were committed to the development and modernization of their societies. These leaders recognized the need for education, infrastructure development, and economic reform, and worked to establish new institutions and structures to achieve these goals. Today, the legacy of the Selangor Civil War can still be felt in the region. Selangor remains one of Malaysia's most important economic and political centers, and continues to be shaped by the complex historical forces that have shaped the region over the centuries. The conflict serves as a reminder of the challenges and opportunities that arise during periods of rapid change and uncertainty, and of the importance of strong leadership and governance in times of crisis. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.